The farmhouse always smelled like cinnamon in autumn. That's what I remember most clearly now, how the scent would wind through the hallways, slip under door frames, and settle into the worn fabric of every armchair. My mother's apple pies, cooling on the kitchen windowsill while Dad's records played softly in the background. I stood on the porch that October morning, key trembling in my hand, and breathed in deeply. The air was different now, emptier. It had been 6 months since I buried both of them, Mom following Dad by just 17 days, but this was my first time returning to the farmhouse alone. As their only child, everything had fallen to me. The grief, the memories, and now, the property. "You can do this, Evelyn," I whispered to myself, the words forming little clouds in the crisp Pennsylvania morning. Lancaster County stretched before me in a patchwork of harvested fields and morning mist. The 3-story white farmhouse with its faded blue shutters had stood on this hill for over a century, watching generations of Harpers live and die. Now it watched me, Evelyn Harper, 68 years old, widowed for 12 years, fumbling with keys like a stranger. Inside, dust. Motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. I moved slowly from room to room, trailing my fingers over the oak dining table where we'd celebrated 57 Thanksgivings, past the grandfather clock that had marked every significant hour of my childhood, up the creaking staircase where the banister still bore the nick from when I'd crashed my bicycle through the front door at age 9. Each room held a universe of memories. Some faded, some so vivid, they stole my breath. In my parents' bedroom, Mom's hairbrush still had silver strands woven between the bristles. Dad's reading glasses rested on his nightstand, folded neatly beside a dog-eared copy of Steinbeck. I hadn't cried at the funeral. I'd been too numb, too focused on arrangements and paperwork and being strong for, everyone else. But here, alone with the ghosts of my past, I finally broke. I sank onto their bed and wept, deep body-shaking sobs that seemed to rise from the very center of my being. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the tears subsided, leaving behind a strange, hollow clarity. This house wasn't just wood and nails and glass. It was the physical embodiment of my heritage, every sacrifice my parents had made, every dream they'd pursued, every value they'd instilled in me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Emily, my daughter, my only child. "Mom? Are you there yet?" Her voice was tight with something I couldn't quite place. "Brandon and I were talking, and we thought we'd drive down tomorrow to help you start sorting through things." Brandon, my son-in-law of 15 years, a financial advisor with a winning smile that never quite reached his eyes. "That's thoughtful, honey, but I'm just getting reacquainted with the place. Maybe next weekend would be better." A pause. Then, "The thing is, we've already cleared our schedules, and Brandon has a colleague in real estate who could stop by to give you an estimate. You know, just so you have an idea of your options." Options. The word hung between us, loaded with unspoken meaning. "I don't need options right now, Emily. I need time." "Mom." Her tone shifted, taking on that patronizing gentleness one might use with a confused child. "You can't possibly be thinking of keeping the farmhouse. It's an hour and a half from Philly. It's too big for one person. The maintenance alone would bankrupt you." "It's been in the family for 4 generations," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "And now it's yours to sell," she countered smoothly. "Think of what you could do with that money. You could get a nice condo near us. You're not getting any younger, Mom. We worry about you out there all alone." The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, Emily listing practical concerns while I offered increasingly weak rebuttals. By the time we hung up, she'd secured my reluctant agreement to at least meet with Brandon's real estate friend the following weekend. I spent the rest of the day wandering through the house, opening windows to let in fresh air, running my fingers over the spines of books in Dad's study, and finally settling at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the family photo albums. Here was Dad at 25, standing proudly beside the farmhouse he'd just inherited from his father. Here was Mom on their wedding day, radiant in a simple white dress, framed by the rose garden she would tend for the next 50 years. Here was me as a gangly teenager, sullen but secretly pleased as Dad taught me to drive the old tractor. And here was Emily, my beautiful daughter, laughing on the tire swing that still hung from the oak tree out back. When had things changed between us? When had her eyes begun to calculate value rather than see worth? The following weekend arrived too quickly. I'd spent the intervening days cleaning, sorting, and rediscovering treasures. Dad's collection of hand-carved birds, Mom's handwritten recipe cards, the quilt my grandmother had stitched from scraps of our old clothing. Emily and Brandon arrived in their gleaming black SUV, dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a visit to their family home. Emily hugged me briefly before immediately beginning to point out issues with the house: the sagging porch step, the outdated kitchen, the inefficient windows. Brandon, tall and broad-shouldered with carefully styled salt and pepper hair, hung back, surveying the property with the detached interest of someone assessing a potential investment. "Marcus should be here soon," he said, checking his watch. "Best real estate guy in Lancaster County. He'll give us a realistic picture. Us, not me. Us." Marcus turned out to be a slick-talking younger man with too much cologne and a tablet full of comparable properties. He walked through the house making notes, occasionally whistling low when he saw original features or muttering about necessary updates to maximize value. We all gathered in the living room afterward. Marcus swiped through slides on his tablet, showing market trends and potential asking prices. The numbers were higher than I'd expected, much higher. "The land alone is worth a fortune," he explained. 15 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland. Developers would be salivating. And the house, while it needs work, has that authentic character wealthy city folks are willing to pay through the nose for. Brandon leaned forward, barely concealing his excitement. "So what are we talking, ballpark?" Marcus named a figure that made Emily gasp. "But that's only if we list soon." Marcus easy, cautioned. "Market's hot now, but who knows for next year? I'd recommend minimal repairs, professional staging, and we could have this place sold by Christmas." "Christmas," I repeated faintly. The thought of strangers hanging stockings in my parents' living room, of bulldozers tearing up Mom's garden for condos or a strip mall, made me physically ill. "It's perfect timing," Brandon said, turning to me with that practiced smile. "You could be settled in a new place before winter really hits. No more worrying about pipes freezing or the roof leaking or who's going to plow that long driveway." "I haven't decided to sell," I said quietly. The room went still. Emily and Brandon exchanged a look I recognized all too well, the mom's being difficult look they'd perfected over the years. "Mom," Emily said slowly, "be reasonable. This place is just wasted space now. You can't manage it alone." "I've been managing just fine," I replied, though we both knew I'd only been back for 2 weeks. Brandon cleared his throat. "Evelyn, we're thinking of your future here. That money could fund a whole new life for you, for all of us." There it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud. "All of us?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Brandon at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Well, you know, family resources should benefit the whole family. Emily is your only heir anyway. It just makes sense to put that equity to work now, when we can all enjoy it." I looked at my daughter, waiting for her to contradict him, to defend me or at least my right to make my own decisions. Instead, she met my gaze coolly and said 7 words that would change everything between us forever. "Either share, Mom, or you're out of the family." The words hung in the air between us like an axe suspended over an executioner's block. Either share, or you're out of the family. My own daughter, threatening to excommunicate me over property and money. I felt something crack inside me, not my heart, which had already been broken when I lost James, my husband, 12 years ago. No, this was the shattering of an illusion, the final fracturing of the image I'd maintained of my daughter as the sensitive, compassionate child I'd raised. "Emily, you don't mean that," I said, searching her face for any sign of the little girl who once cried when she accidentally stepped on a caterpillar. "I do, Mom. We've talked about this." Her voice was calm, practiced. "Brandon and I have been carrying the emotional labor of this family for years. We've put our lives on hold, waiting for something like this. Waiting for my parents to die?" My voice was barely a whisper. Brandon stepped in, his tone conciliatory but his eyes cold. "That's not fair, Evelyn. What Emily means is that we've been planning our future, and this inheritance is part of that plan. The smart move is to liquidate this asset and distribute the benefits while you're still alive to see it." Marcus, the realtor, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe I should step outside while you folks discuss family matters." "No need," I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. "I think we're done here. Thank you for your time, Marcus, but I won't be needing your services today." Emily stood too, color rising in her cheeks. "Mom, don't be stubborn about this. The farmhouse is falling apart. It'll be a money pit for you. And for what? Sentimentality?" "This isn't just about sentiment," I said. "This house represents everything your grandparents worked for. Everything they believed in. Brandon snorted. What they believed in was working themselves to the bone for a property that's now worth millions to developers. Think about that, Evelyn. Millions. Your parents would want you to be practical. The audacity of this man telling me what my parents would have wanted made my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady. My parents believed in legacy, Brandon. In passing down not just property, but values. And right now, I don't see much of those values in either of you. Emily's expression hardened. This isn't about values. It's about you being selfish and living in the past. Dad would have understood the practical aspects of this decision. The mention of James was the final straw. Don't you dare use your father to manipulate me, I said, my voice finally breaking. He loved this farm. Almost as much as my parents did. He helped Dad fix the barn roof the summer before he got sick. And look where that got him, Brandon muttered, not quite under his breath. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. James had been diagnosed with cancer shortly after helping my father with that roof. Brandon's implication that somehow the farm had contributed to my husband's illness was so absurd and cruel that I couldn't even formulate a response. I think you should leave, I said finally. Both of you. Fine, Emily snapped, grabbing her designer purse. But this conversation isn't over. The longer you wait to sell, the more the property will deteriorate. Call us when you're ready to be reasonable. They left in a flurry of slammed doors and spinning tires on the gravel driveway. Marcus mumbled awkward apologies and followed soon after, leaving me alone in the suddenly too quiet house. That night, I sat on the porch swing, wrapped in my mother's old cardigan despite the relatively mild evening. The stars were brilliant away from the city lights, one of the countless small joys this place offered that Emily and Brandon couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. I rocked slowly, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had my daughter always been this person, and I'd been too blind to see it? Or had Brandon's influence gradually shaped her into someone who could threaten her own mother with exile from the family? Either way, I was facing a devastating truth. The two people I'd thought would protect my interests were actually my adversaries. I was alone in this battle. The realization should have crushed me. Instead, it was oddly liberating. If I was truly alone, then I was also truly free. Free to make decisions without concerning myself with pleasing people who had shown they didn't have my best interests at heart. The next morning, I called my parents' longtime attorney, Howard Mendelson. Howard had been my father's poker buddy and had handled the Harpers' legal affairs for over 40 years. If anyone could help me navigate this situation, it would be him. We met for lunch at a small diner in town, away from prying eyes and ears. Howard, now in his 70s but still sharp as a tack, listened without interruption as I recounted the confrontation with Emily and Brandon. Can't say I'm entirely surprised, he said when I'd finished. Brandon's made some inquiries about the property over the years, you know. Called my office 3 times after your mother passed, asking about the terms of the will and when it would be executed. He what? I felt sick. Why didn't you tell me? Howard shrugged. Client confidentiality. I couldn't tell him anything, of course, but I also couldn't tell you about his inquiries without cause for concern. Now that you've brought it up, though, he sighed heavily. Evelyn, what do you want to do with the farmhouse? Truly, setting aside your daughter's demands. I considered the question carefully. I don't think I want to live there permanently. Too many memories, too much space for one person. But I can't bear the thought of developers tearing it down or turning it into condos. Howard nodded, sipping his coffee. Your father felt the same way. We had many conversations about the future of the property. He always hoped it would stay in the family, but he was realistic about the challenges. What would you advise? Legally, the property is yours, free and clear. You can do whatever you want with it. But if you're concerned about Brandon and Emily's pressure tactics, and it sounds like you should be, then we need to think strategically. He pulled out a small notebook and jotted down some notes. First, we document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every attempt to coerce you. Second, we secure the property, change the locks, install security cameras. Third, we explore options that would honor your parents' legacy while protecting your interests. What kind of options? Howard's bright-eyed eyes twinkled. Your father and I used to discuss a few scenarios. There's a land conservation trust that might be interested in the agricultural portions. The Historical Society has always admired the house itself. And then there's Jonathan Reeves. Jonathan Reeves? The name sounded vaguely familiar. Developer from Philadelphia. Unlike most, he specializes in preserving historical properties, rather than demolishing them. Made a fortune turning old factories into mixed-use spaces, but he has a soft spot for rural preservation. Met your father at some agricultural conference years ago and expressed interest in the property, not to build on, but to restore and maintain. And Dad considered this? Your father considered all possibilities. He wanted to be prepared. Jonathan made a gentleman's agreement that if the property ever came up for sale, your father would give him first right of refusal. Nothing legally binding, just an understanding between two men who respected tradition. Howard paused. Interesting coincidence. Jonathan's company just bought that old textile mill in downtown Lancaster. He's in the area quite regularly these days. A plan began to form in my mind, not a malicious one, but a protective one. A way to honor my parents' wishes while ensuring that the farmhouse would be preserved, not exploited. Howard, I said slowly, I'd like to meet this Jonathan Reeves. And I'd like to do it without Emily and Brandon knowing. Howard smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged the seriousness of what we were discussing. I thought you might say that. I'll make some calls. As we finished our lunch, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my parents died. Purpose. I was done being a victim of my daughter and son-in-law's manipulation. It was time to take control of my own inheritance and my own life. For the first time in months, I slept soundly that night, lulled by the familiar creaks and sighs of the old farmhouse, and comforted by the knowledge that I was finally standing up for myself. The call from Howard came 3 days later. Jonathan Reeves could meet me the following afternoon at the farmhouse. I spent the morning in a flurry of nervous energy, dusting furniture that didn't need dusting, arranging fresh-cut zinnias from Mom's garden in a blue ceramic vase, brewing coffee that would be cold by the time he arrived. Why was I so anxious? This wasn't a social call or, God forbid, a date. This was business. The business of protecting what mattered to me. Still, as I changed my outfit for the third time, settling on a simple navy dress that James had always liked, I couldn't help feeling like this meeting represented something pivotal. At precisely 2 o'clock, a vehicle crunched up the gravel driveway. I'd expected something ostentatious, a luxury car befitting a successful developer. Instead, a modestly elegant gray pickup truck pulled up, its only concession to luxury the gleaming chrome detailing that caught the afternoon sun. The man who stepped out was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in what I'd come to think of as gentleman farmer attire. Well-worn jeans, a crisp button-down shirt rolled at the sleeves, and leather boots that had seen their fair share of actual work. His hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered but handsome in a lived-in way. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Mrs. Harper?" he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Jonathan Reeves. Howard told me I'd find you here." I stepped onto the porch and extended my hand. His grip was firm. Without being crushing, his eyes, a striking hazel, direct and assessing, but not unkind. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reeves," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Please, call me Evelyn." "Then I'm Jonathan," he replied with an easy smile. "And the pleasure is mine. I've admired this property for years, ever since your father gave me the grand tour back in '09. You knew my father." "Well?" I asked, leading him into the house. "Not well, but meaningfully," he said, ducking slightly to avoid the low door frame, a habit of tall men in old houses. "We met at an agricultural preservation conference where I was speaking. He invited me here afterward, and we spent an afternoon walking the property while he told me its history. William Harper was a remarkable man, passionate about this. Land in a way you don't often see anymore. The way he said my father's name, with genuine respect, not the performative deference Brandon always showed, made me feel instantly more comfortable. In the kitchen, I poured coffee while Jonathan looked around appreciatively. "The bones of this place are extraordinary," he said. "That original woodwork, the hand-forged hardware. They don't build houses like this anymore because they can't. The craftsmanship is a lost art. My father and mother maintained everything meticulously," I said, setting a mug before him. "Dad used to say that we didn't own the house. We were just its current caretakers." Jonathan nodded. "A wise perspective. And now you're faced with deciding what happens next in its story." I appreciated that he didn't phrase it as a leading question or make assumptions about my intentions. "Yes," I said simply. "Howard may have mentioned that I'm under some family pressure regarding the property." He outlined the situation, Jonathan confirmed, his expression neutral. "I understand that difficult position. Family dynamics can be complicated when property and money enter the equation." "Complicated is one word for it," I so. said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. My daughter and son-in-law see the farmhouse as nothing more than a cash cow waiting to be slaughtered. Jonathan winced at my metaphor but nodded understanding. And you see it as something more. It's my heritage, my history, the culmination of 4 generations of Harpers working this land, loving this house, building something meaningful. I paused, collecting myself. But I'm also realistic. I'm 68 years old. I live alone. The practical challenges of maintaining a property like this are significant. So what is it you're hoping for, Evelyn? He asked, looking at me over the rim of his coffee mug. The directness of the question caught me off guard. What was I hoping for? I hadn't fully articulated it even to myself. I want the farmhouse preserved, not demolished. I want Mom's rose garden to bloom next spring, and the one after that. I want the barn to stand, even if it's repurposed. I want someone to care about this place the way my family has. I took a breath, and I want to make my own decision about it, not be bullied into something that benefits my son-in-law's financial aspirations. Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I think I can help with all of that. Would you be open to walking the property with me? I'd like to see how it's changed since I was here last. For the next 2 hours, we toured the house and grounds together. Jonathan asked insightful questions, took notes, and occasionally snapped photos with his phone, always asking permission first. Unlike Marcus, the realtor, who had evaluated everything in terms of dollar signs, Jonathan seemed to see the soul of the place. The way the late afternoon light streamed through the stained glass transom over the front door, casting rainbow patterns on the entryway floor. The perfect acoustics of the parlor where Mom's piano still sat. The way the old oak tree's roots had gradually pushed up a section of the stone path, creating what Dad had jokingly called nature's speed bump. We ended our tour at the small family cemetery at the far end of the property, where generations of Harpers rested beneath simple granite markers. My parents' twin headstones were still bright against the weathered gray of their ancestors. This is sacred ground, Jonathan said quietly. Developers would see it as a complication, an obstacle to maximizing buildable acreage. I see it as the heart of the property. I glanced at him, surprised by how closely his sentiment matched my own feelings. What exactly is it that you do, Jonathan? I asked. Howard described you as a developer, but you don't seem like any developer I've ever met. He smiled. I'm a preservationist who happens to develop property. My company, Keystone Heritage, specializes in adaptive reuse, finding new purposes for historic structures while maintaining their architectural and cultural integrity. We've converted old mills into apartment buildings, barns into event venues, farmhouses into bed and breakfasts, all while preserving the essential character and history of the original structures. And you're interested in my parents' farmhouse? Very. Much so, he replied. But more importantly, I'm interested in helping you find a solution that honors their legacy and gives you peace of mind. As we walked back toward the house in the fading light, I felt a spark of hope for the first time since Emily had issued her ultimatum. Here was someone who saw value beyond dollar signs, who understood what this place meant. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't end in heartbreak. I'd like to make you an offer, Evelyn, Jonathan said as we reached the porch. Not just for the property, but for its future. I invited Jonathan back inside and we settled in my father's study. The room still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books, Dad's sanctuary where he'd kept meticulous records of crop rotations, rainfall, patterns, and family accounts for over 50 years. Jonathan placed his portfolio on the desk between us and opened it to reveal detailed sketches, plans, and photographs. What I'm proposing is a conservation development, he explained. The farmhouse would be restored to its original glory and converted into a small country inn. The barn would become a community space for local events, farmers, markets, educational workshops. The agricultural land would remain in production through partnerships with local organic farmers. He flipped to another page showing a site plan. We'd build a limited number of cottage-style homes, architecturally compatible with the existing structures, clustered on the eastern 5 acres, preserving the remaining 10 acres as open space. The family cemetery would, be maintained and protected in perpetuity. I studied the drawings, impressed by the thoughtfulness of the design. This wasn't the soulless subdivision Brandon had envisioned, with identical McMansions crammed onto quarter-acre lots. This was something that respected the spirit of the place while giving it new life. And what happens to me in this scenario? I asked, meeting his gaze. That's Entirely up to you, he replied. Some of our sellers choose to take the proceeds and move on completely. Others retain certain rights or privileges, a lifetime stay in one of the cottages, for instance, or a seat on the property's governing board. I'm open to creative arrangements that serve your needs. And financially? What are we talking about? Jonathan named a figure. Slightly less than what? Marcus had suggested the property might fetch from a conventional developer, but still substantial. That's my starting offer, he added. But I'm more interested in finding terms that work for both of us than in driving the hardest possible bargain. I sat back, processing. The proposal was appealing, almost too perfect. Why are you doing this, Jonathan? Surely there are easier properties to develop, without family complications or emotional attachments. He considered my question for a moment. When I was a young man, he began, my grandparents lost their family farm in the Midwest. 4 generations of history bulldozed for a shopping mall. It nearly broke them. I swore then that if I ever had the means, I'd find ways to prevent that from happening to other families. He gestured to the plans. This isn't charity. It's good business to preserve properties with history and character, but it's also personal for me. His sincerity was palpable, but I'd learned the hard way to be cautious. I'd need time to think about this, and to consult with Howard. Of course, Jonathan said, gathering his materials. Take whatever time you need. The property isn't going anywhere. He paused, then added, but I should mention that I'll be in the area for only 2 more weeks before returning to Philadelphia for the rest of the year. If we're going to move forward, sooner would be better than later. After he left, I called Howard immediately. What do you think? I asked after describing Jonathan's proposal. Is he legitimate? Is the offer fair? Jonathan Reeves is as solid as they come, Howard assured me. I've reviewed several of his contracts over the years for other clients. His terms are always fair, and he follows through on his promises. As for the offer, it's in the ballpark, maybe a bit conservative. But remember, you're not just selling property, you're buying peace of mind about its future. I spent the next few days in deep reflection, walking every inch of the property, sitting in each room of the house, trying to imagine it transformed as Jonathan had described. I even drove to Lancaster to see one of his completed projects, an old flour mill converted into loft apartments with a restaurant and shops on the ground floor. The renovation was stunning, honoring the building's industrial past while creating a vibrant new space. Meanwhile, Emily and Brandon called daily, their messages growing increasingly insistent. Mom, we need to schedule that realtor again. Mom, we found a great retirement community near us you should look at. Mom, Brandon's investors are ready to make an offer on the property. Brandon's investors. The phrase made my blood boil. How long had they been planning this? How many conversations had they had about my parents' property before my parents were even gone? The final straw came when Emily texted, Brandon says if you won't cooperate, we should look into having you declared incompetent to manage your affairs. For your own good, of course. For my own good. The patronizing cruelty of it stole my breath away. I made my decision that night. The next morning, I called Jonathan and asked him to meet me at Howard's office. By sunset, we had signed the preliminary paperwork. Within a week, we'd completed all the necessary inspections and assessments. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday, a remarkably accelerated timeline made possible by Jonathan's resources and Howard's efficiency. Through it all, I told no one. Not my bridge club friends, not my sister-in-law in Arizona, and certainly not Emily and Brandon. When they called, I deflected, saying I was still considering my options. When they threatened to visit, I claimed I had appointments or wasn't feeling well. The morning of the closing, I woke early, watching dawn break over the fields my father had plowed for decades. I felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief for what I was losing, relief at finding a solution that honored my parents' legacy, and yes, a certain vindictive satisfaction at the thought of Emily and Brandon's reaction when they discovered what I'd done. At Howard's office, Jonathan and I signed the final documents. The deed transferred, the substantial check was deposited directly into my account, and we shook hands on our agreement. I would have lifetime rights to stay in one of the yet-to-be-built, cottages if I chose, but in the meantime, I would relocate to a charming apartment Jonathan owned in downtown Lancaster. One last thing, Jonathan said as we concluded our business. I'm hosting a small gathering at the farmhouse next Saturday. Just a few local officials, historical society members, and neighbors to introduce the project to the community. Would you be willing to attend? As the Property's steward for so many years, your blessing would mean a lot. I hesitated. Will there be press? I'm not sure I want this in the local papers just yet. No press, he assured me. Just key stakeholders. It's important to get community buy-in early in the process. Then yes, I agreed. I'll be there. What I didn't tell him was that Emily and Brandon had already informed me they'd be visiting that weekend to settle things once and for all. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd planned it. As I left Howard's office, the weight of property ownership lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a new, lighter feeling I recognized after a moment as freedom. For the first time in months, I was moving forward on my own terms, not reacting to others' demands. The farmhouse was no longer mine, but neither would it be Brandon and Emily's cash cow. It would live on, transformed, but not destroyed. And I would find my way to a new chapter, free from manipulation and threats. Now I just had to wait one more week for the final act to play out. The week between signing the papers and Jonathan's gathering passed in a strange limbo. I spent my days packing personal mementos, family photographs, and cherished heirlooms. Not everything, just the irreplaceable treasures that carried memories too precious to leave behind. My new apartment wouldn't be ready for another 2 weeks, so Jonathan had generously offered to let me stay in the farmhouse until then. It's still your home, he'd insisted. And frankly, having you there deters vandalism and gives the property a lived-in feel for potential investors. I appreciated his practical justification, but I suspected the true motivation was kindness. Jonathan Reeves was proving to be that rarest of creatures, a businessman with integrity. Every evening that week, I sat on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sunset paint the fields gold, then amber, then deep purple. I spoke aloud to my parents, sometimes explaining my decision, seeking their approval from beyond. The soft evening breeze rustling through Mom's rose bushes felt like their answer, a gentle benediction. Emily called twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail, unable to maintain the pretense any longer, but not yet ready for the confrontation. Her messages grew increasingly irritated. Mom, we've been trying to reach you for days. Brandon's realtor friend has potential buyers who want to see the property this weekend. Call me back immediately. The second message was shorter and colder. We're driving up Saturday morning. Be ready to talk seriously. This has gone on long enough. I didn't return the calls. What was there to say now? The deed was done, literally and figuratively. Soon enough, they would understand exactly how seriously I had taken matters into my own hands. Friday evening, I received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black Tesla pulled up the driveway, and Howard emerged carrying a bottle of champagne. Thought you might want some company tonight, he said, following me into the kitchen where I found 2 glasses. Eve of battle and all that. I smiled, grateful for his perceptiveness. Is that what tomorrow is? A battle? More like the unveiling of a checkmate they don't yet know has happened, he replied, expertly opening the champagne with a quiet pop. But still, momentous occasions deserve proper marking. We settled in the living room with our bubbling glasses. Howard had been my parents' attorney for decades, but tonight he was here as a friend. Are you having second thoughts? He asked, his keen eyes assessing me. I considered the question carefully. Not about selling to Jonathan. That feels right. Dad would approve, I think. But I do wonder if I should have confronted Emily and Brandon directly, told them what I was doing and why. Howard shook his head. From what you've described of their behavior, they would have escalated their tactics, possibly even sought emergency intervention to block the sale. Sometimes the cleanest cut is the one made quickly and without warning. That sounds almost ruthless, I said, sipping my champagne. Self-protection isn't ruthless, Evelyn. It's necessary. He leaned back in his chair, the lamplight casting warm shadows across his lined face. Your daughter and son-in-law were willing to use threats and manipulation to get what they wanted. They forfeited the right to transparency when they refused to respect your autonomy. Put that way, it made perfect sense. Yet a mother's heart is complicated. Despite everything, Emily was still my child, the baby I'd nursed through fevers, the little girl who'd picked dandelions for my birthday, the young woman I'd watched graduate from college with tears of pride in my eyes. When had she changed? Or had this calculating side always been there, waiting for circumstances to bring it to the surface? I keep thinking about nature versus nurture, I confessed to Howard, wondering where I went wrong with her. Don't do that to yourself, Howard said firmly. Adults make their own choices. Emily chose Brandon, chose his values, chose to prioritize material gain over your feelings and wishes. Those aren't your choices or your responsibility. We talked late into the evening, reminiscing about the old days, about my parents and the community they'd built around them. Howard shared stories I'd never heard, about how my father had quietly paid the property taxes for 3 neighboring farms during the recession of the early 1980s, about how my mother had established an unofficial food bank from her vast garden harvests, feeding half the county during hard times. They were extraordinary people who never saw themselves that way, Howard said fondly. They just did what they thought was right, consistently, and without fanfare. I hope I've done right by them, I said softly. You have, Howard assured me. Tomorrow will be difficult in some ways, but remember, you're standing on the moral high ground here. No matter what Emily or Brandon say, you've protected something precious rather than allowing it to be exploited. There's dignity in that. After he left, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the dark house, saying goodbye to each room, each memory. In my parents' bedroom, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of their bed and pulled out a hand-stitched quilt my grandmother had made for their wedding. Ohio star pattern in blues and creams, now softened with age. I wrapped it around my shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of cedar and the even fainter echo of my mother's lavender sachet. Tomorrow would indeed be a reckoning. But tonight, enfolded in family history made tactile, I felt ready for whatever came. The next morning dawned clear and bright. One of those perfect September days that seems to hover between summer and fall. Warm sunshine tempered by a crisp breeze. I dressed carefully in a sage green dress I knew flattered me, applied subtle makeup, and styled my silver hair in the soft bob that James had always said made me look like a sophisticated pixie. Armor of a sort. Jonathan arrived first, around 10 o'clock, to set up for the noon gathering. He brought fresh flowers for the tables, locally catered appetizers, and a small team to arrange chairs on the lawn. How are you feeling? He asked, finding me in the kitchen arranging cookies on a platter, my mother's recipe, a small contribution to the occasion. Nervous, I admitted, but resolved. Second thoughts? No, just preparing, myself for the confrontation. He nodded, understanding. Do your daughter and son-in-law know about the sale? Not yet, but they're coming today, supposedly to settle things once and for all regarding the property. I managed a wry smile. They'll certainly be settling things, just not in the way they imagine. Jonathan looked concerned. If you'd rather they not encounter me or our guests, I can reschedule the gathering. The offer was considerate, but I shook my head firmly. No, I want witnesses, not for drama's sake, but because I suspect they'll try to deny or twist what happens. Having neutral observers present feels safer, somehow. I understand, he said, squeezing my shoulder gently. I'll be nearby if you need support. By 11:30, cars began arriving. Members of the Historical Society, a county commissioner, 2 representatives from the Land Conservation Trust, several neighbors, even Pastor Mitchell from my parents' church. About 20 people in all, milling about the lawn with punch cups and small plates, admiring the property and greeting me with warm hugs or handshakes. It was 12:15 when I heard it, the distinctive purr of Brandon's expensive SUV coming up the driveway. My heart began to race. After months of emotional manipulation and veiled threats, the moment of truth had arrived. I took a steadying breath and walked to the edge of the porch, watching as the black vehicle pulled to a stop. Emily emerged first, her face set in what I'd come to think of as her handling mom expression, determined but with a veneer of artificial patience. Brandon followed, checking his reflection in the car window and straightening his designer polo shirt. They both froze when they saw the gathering on the lawn. Confusion crossed their faces, followed by annoyance. Mom? Emily called, approaching with Brandon close behind. What's going on here? Who are all these people? The moment had come, and suddenly I felt perfectly calm. Hello, Emily, Brandon, I said, my voice steady. This is a small reception Jonathan Reeves is hosting to introduce himself to the community. Jonathan, could you come here for a moment? Jonathan excused himself from a conversation with the county commissioner and walked over, extending his hand to my daughter and son-in-law with a warm smile. Jonathan Reeves, you must be Evelyn's family. I've heard so much about you. The confusion on their faces deepened. Brandon shook Jonathan's hand automatically, his realtor's instincts kicking in despite his bewilderment. Brandon Wells, this is my wife, Emily. I'm afraid I don't understand what's happening here. Mr. Reeves is the new owner of the farmhouse, I said simply. There was a moment of perfect suspended silence. Emily's face went blank with shock, while Brandon's complexion shifted from its normal ruddy tone to an alarming shade of red. The new— What? Emily finally managed, her voice strangled. Mom, what are you talking about? I sold the farmhouse to Jonathan last week, I explained, keeping my voice level. The transaction is complete. The deed has been transferred and the funds have been deposited. Brandon recovered first, his expression hardening as he stepped closer to me. That's impossible. You can't have sold the property without consulting us. We had plans. You had plans, I corrected him. I had different ones. This is absurd, he hissed, lowering his voice as he became aware of curious glances from the guests nearby. Whatever this man offered you, I guarantee my investors would have paid more. You've cheated yourself and us out of a significant amount of money. Jonathan cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. Your mother has been very gracious in allowing us to host this reception. I'm sure she'd appreciate the same courtesy. His calm authority seemed to momentarily disarm Brandon, who nodded stiffly. The four of us moved into the house, into Dad's study, where just weeks before, Jonathan had first shown me his vision for the property. As soon as the door closed, Emily erupted. How could you do this? Behind our backs? After everything we've done for you? Tears welled in her eyes. Whether from genuine hurt or frustrated rage, I couldn't tell anymore. What exactly have you done for me, Emily? I asked quietly. Threatened to cut me out of the family if I didn't comply with your demands? Suggested having me declared incompetent? Treated me like an obstacle rather than your mother? She flinched as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair. We were trying to help you make a sensible decision. This place was too much for you to handle alone. Yet somehow I managed to handle selling it all by myself, I replied, unable to keep a touch of irony from my voice. Brandon had been eerily silent, studying Jonathan with narrowed eyes. Now he spoke. I know who you are. Jonathan Reeves of Keystone Heritage. You're the preservationist developer who turned the old Zimmerman mill into luxury apartments. Jonathan nodded. That's one of our projects, yes. Brandon turned to me, his expression calculating. How much did he pay you? Whatever it wasn't enough. This property could have been developed into a subdivision worth millions. The price was fair, I said. And more importantly, Jonathan's plans for the farmhouse align with my values. The house will be preserved, the agricultural land will remain productive, and the family cemetery will be protected in perpetuity. Values don't pay bills, Brandon scoffed. You've been swindled by a smooth-talking conservationist with an agenda. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, but remained composed. Mr. Wells, I understand your disappointment, but I assure you, this was a standard business transaction between consenting parties. Mrs. Harper's attorney oversaw every aspect of the sale. Howard was in on this too? Emily asked, betrayal thick in her voice. Howard did. His job, I said firmly. He protected my interests, as he's done for our family for over 40 years. Brandon began pacing, his mind visibly working through options, looking for angles. This can't be legal. You didn't have our consent? I didn't need it, I interrupted. The property was mine alone. My name was on the deed. But we're family, Emily cried. You had a moral obligation to consult us to consider our future, just as you had a moral obligation not to threaten or manipulate your mother? Jonathan asked mildly. All three of us turned to him, startled by his direct intervention. His eyes were kind but uncompromising as he addressed Emily. Mrs. Harper has shared some of the pressure tactics you and your husband employed. I have to say, if my mother were alive, I would sooner live in a cardboard box than attempt to force her out of her home for my financial gain. Emily's face flushed crimson. You have no right to judge our family dynamics. You're just a vulture who swooped in and took advantage of an elderly woman. I'd had enough. I am 68 years old, not infirm or incompetent. I made this decision with full awareness of all options, including the one you and Brandon were pushing. I chose to preserve my parents' legacy rather than see it demolished for your investment portfolio. Brandon's expression suddenly shifted, his anger giving way to a calculating smile that made my skin crawl. Well, what's done is done. We'll have to make the best of it. He turned to Jonathan. All business now. Let's talk numbers. Whatever you paid my mother-in-law, I'm prepared to offer you 15% above that to take the property off your hands today. Jonathan didn't even blink. I'm afraid the property isn't for sale, Mr. Wells. We begin restoration next month, and the conversion to an inn and community space should be completed within a year. 20%, Brandon pressed. My investors are serious. As am I, Jonathan replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. This isn't a flipping opportunity, Mr. Wells. It's a legacy project. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should return to my guests. He nodded politely to all of us and exited, leaving me alone with my daughter and son-in-law. The silence stretched taut between us, filled with unspoken accusations and irreparable damage. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice hollow. So that's it? You've sold our inheritance to a stranger? I sold my property to someone who will honor its history, I corrected her. And as for inheritance, you seem to have forgotten that inheritances traditionally come after death, not before, and at the discretion of the person doing the bequeathing. Brandon snorted. Semantics. You knew we were counting on that money. That was your mistake, I said simply. Not mine. He grabbed Emily's arm. Come on, there's nothing more to be done here. Your mother has made her choice. Yes, I said quietly. I have. Emily paused at the door, turning back with tears streaming down her face. You'll regret this, Mom. When you're all alone in some depressing apartment, with no one to help you as you get older, you'll wish you'd made different choices. Her words were meant to wound, to plant seeds of fear and doubt. A few months ago, they might have. But standing in my father's study, with the warm September sunlight streaming through windows that had witnessed a century of Harper family history, I felt only certainty. I'd rather be alone with my dignity than surrounded by people who value me only for what I can give them, I said. Goodbye, Emily. The door is always open if you ever want to be my daughter again rather than Brandon's accomplice. She flinched as if I'd struck her, then hurried out after her husband. I heard the SUV's engine roar to life, gravel spraying as they backed up and sped away down the driveway. I remained in the study for several minutes, letting the encounter settle around me. Had imagined this confrontation dozens of times in recent weeks, sometimes with shouting, sometimes with tears, occasionally with reconciliation. The reality had been both worse and better than I'd anticipated, worse in the painful finality of it, better in the clarity it provided. When I finally rejoined the gathering outside, Jonathan approached with concern in his eyes. Are you all right? That couldn't have been easy. No, I agreed, but it was necessary. He nodded, understanding. Your daughter and son-in-law left rather abruptly. They did, I said, managing a small smile. I suspect they won't be attending the grand opening of the inn. Their loss, Jonathan replied, handing me a glass of lemonade. Come. The Historical Society president wants to show you some photographs. They've uncovered of the farmhouse from the 1920s. Apparently your grandfather is in several of them. As we walked toward the small group waiting beneath the old oak tree, I felt a weight lifting. Not just the burden of the property, but the heavier load of toxic family expectations. For the first time in months, I was moving forward rather than being pushed. The battle was over. And in my own quiet way, I had won. October bled into November, and the trees surrounding the farmhouse flamed in brilliant reds and golds before surrendering their leaves to the cooling winds. I settled into my apartment in downtown Lancaster, a charming second-floor space in a converted Victorian with high ceilings, original woodwork, and windows that overlooked a small park. It was one of Jonathan's properties as promised, though I insisted on paying a fair market rent. Independence, once reclaimed, was not something I intended to relinquish again. The apartment was cozy without being cramped, easily manageable without feeling institutional. A far cry from the sterile retirement community Brandon had selected for me. I arranged my parents' cherished photographs on the mantel, placed Mom's antique writing desk beneath the bay window, and hung Dad's collection of hand-carved birds along one wall. New space, old treasures, a fitting metaphor for this chapter of my life. 2 weeks after moving in, I received a letter from Emily. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it, both dreading and hoping for what might be inside. The letter was brief, typed rather than handwritten. Mom, Brandon, and I are still processing what happened with the farmhouse. While we disagree with your decision, we recognize that it was yours to make. Perhaps in time we can find a way forward as a family. We will be spending the holidays with Brandon's parents in Colorado this year, but I'll call when we return in January. Take care of yourself, Emily. No apology, no real acknowledgement of the manipulation they'd attempted, but also no further recriminations. It was as close to an olive branch as Emily's pride would allow, I suspected. Whether it would lead to genuine reconciliation remained to be seen, but I tucked the letter away with cautious hope. Time and distance might provide perspective that confrontation couldn't. Meanwhile, I was building a new life piece by piece. I joined a book club at the local library, volunteered 2 mornings a week at the Historical Society. Their archives needed organizing, and who better than a former high school librarian? And even signed up for a watercolor class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never found time for during my working years. Jonathan stopped by occasionally, usually bearing pastries from the German bakery down the street and updates on the farmhouse restoration. The project was proceeding on schedule, with careful attention to preserving original details while updating systems for modern use. The rose garden is dormant now, of course, he told me one November afternoon as we shared coffee in my living room, but we've documented the layout and varieties. The Thai landscape architect is confident we can restore it to its former glory by next summer. Mom would be pleased, I said, feeling a bittersweet pang. Those roses were her pride and joy. We found something interesting when we were assessing the barn foundation, Jonathan added, pulling out his phone to show me photographs. Hidden beneath one of the cornerstone blocks was a small metal box, a time capsule of sorts. We thought you should be the one to open it. The following weekend, we met at the farmhouse. Construction crews were absent for the day, and a hushed quality hung over the property, as if it were holding its breath between past and future. The air was sharp with the promise of the season's first snow, and my breath formed small clouds as we walked toward the barn. Jonathan handed me the box, a rusted tin container about the size of a hardcover novel. The lid was stuck, but with some careful prying, it finally yielded. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had protected it from moisture, was a collection of family treasures. A small diary with my grandfather's name inscribed on the flyleaf, a handful of wheat pennies, a delicate gold locket containing a tiny braid of dark hair, and several photographs I'd never seen before. My grandparents as young people, standing proudly before a newly constructed barn. June 17, 1933, I read from the back of one photo. They built this barn during the Depression. It must have been an act of tremendous faith in the future. There was also a letter, the paper brittle with age. I unfolded it carefully to reveal my grandfather's bold handwriting. To whoever finds this, may you care for this land as we have, with respect for what it gives and patience for what it demands. A farm is never truly owned, it is merely borrowed from future generations. May you be worthy stewards of this trust. William Harper Sr., June 1933. I looked up at Jonathan, eyes brimming with unexpected tears. He would have approved of what you're doing here, of the decisions I made. He nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Your family built something that deserves to endure. I'm honored to be part of continuing that legacy, just in a new form. As we walked back toward the house, snowflakes began to drift lazily from the pearl gray sky, dusting the fields and buildings with a soft white blanket. The farmhouse looked different already. Scaffolding embraced one wing where exterior restoration had begun, and the front porch had been carefully dismantled for rebuilding according to historical specifications. Yet its essential character remained, solid and dignified against the winter landscape. Will you come to the opening next summer? Jonathan asked as we reached my car. I wouldn't miss it, I assured him, surprised by how much I meant it. The property no longer felt like a burden of obligation, but like an old friend embarking on a new adventure, one I could visit and enjoy without the weight of maintenance and memory. That evening, back in my apartment, I carefully arranged the items from the time capsule on my desk and began researching proper preservation methods. The diary, especially, was a precious link to my grandfather, whose voice I barely remembered but whose values had shaped our family for generations. As I gently turned its pages, a small piece of paper fluttered out. A receipt, dated 1931, for the purchase of a diamond ring. On the back, in my grandmother's elegant script, were the words, "He sold his best hunting rifle to buy this ring, though times were hard. Never forget that love outweighs possessions." I traced my finger over her handwriting, feeling a profound connection across time. 4 generations of Harpers had prioritized love and legacy over material gain. Emily and Brandon had temporarily lost sight of that wisdom, but perhaps, in time, they might rediscover it. The thought brought me peace as I prepared for my first holiday season alone in decades. Not truly alone, though. I had new friends from the book club, my watercolor classmates had organized a festive gathering, and Howard had invited me to Christmas dinner with his family. My world was expanding rather than contracting, rich with new possibilities I hadn't imagined when this journey began. As the snow fell silently outside my window, I opened my grandfather's diary and began to read, listening for echoes of wisdom across the years. Whatever the future held, reconciliation with Emily or a permanently altered relationship, I knew I had honored my heritage in the ways that truly mattered. The farmhouse would endure, and so would I. 7 months passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Winter gave way to a tentative spring, which blossomed into the full glory of summer. My, life settled into new rhythms. Watercolor classes on Tuesdays, historical society volunteer work on Wednesdays and Fridays, book club every other Thursday evening. I'd made friends, particularly Claire from watercolors and Meredith from book club, both widows like me who understood the complex geography of building a life alone after decades of partnership. Emily called in January as promised. Our conversations stilted but civil. We spoke every few weeks after that, carefully avoiding mention of Brandon or the farmhouse, focusing instead on neutral topics. Her work, my new hobbies, the unusually rainy spring. It wasn't the close relationship we'd once had, but it was something, a fragile bridge being rebuilt one plank at a time. In late June, I received a thick cream envelope in the mail. Inside was an invitation to the grand opening of Harper Hill Inn and Heritage Farm, scheduled for July 15th. The elegant card featured a watercolor rendering of the restored farmhouse, surrounded by Mom's rose garden in full bloom. A handwritten note from Jonathan was paperclipped to the invitation. "You should be the guest of honor. Please say yes." I traced my finger over the image of the farmhouse, my childhood home, transformed yet preserved. A week later, I called Emily. "There's something happening at the farmhouse next month," I said carefully. "A grand opening celebration for its new iteration. I'm going and I'd like you to come with me if you're willing." The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Is Brandon invited too?" she finally asked, her voice neutral. I took a deep breath. "Yes, if he can be civil." "This isn't about rehashing the past, Emily. It's about seeing what's been created from it. I think your grandparents would have wanted you to see it." Another long pause. "I'll talk to Brandon," she said at last. "No promises, but I'll consider it." It wasn't quite the enthusiastic acceptance I'd hoped for, but it was more than I'd feared. Progress, of a sort. The day of the grand opening arrived, bright and perfect. The sky an unblemished blue that seemed to stretch forever over the Lancaster countryside. I dressed carefully in a floral sundress and Mom's pearl earrings, drove myself to the farmhouse, and parked in the newly graveled lot where once the eastern hayfield had been. The transformation was breathtaking. The farmhouse gleamed in fresh white paint with the blue shutters restored to their original vibrancy. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt with meticulous attention to historical detail, complete with the porch swing where I'd spent countless summer evenings. The ancient oak tree still stood sentinel in the front yard, now surrounded by a circular brick patio with benches and planters. Most stunning of all was Mom's rose garden, restored to its former glory and expanded along pathways that wound toward the converted barn. Dozens of varieties bloomed in a riot of colors and fragrances, just as they had in her lifetime. Jonathan met me at the entrance, dapper in a light summer suit. "What do you think?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with anticipation. "It's magnificent," I said. "Honestly, better than I could have imagined." He offered his arm and led me on a tour of the property. The farmhouse interior had been reconfigured into guest suites, each named for a different agricultural crop historically grown on the property. The wheat room, the corn suite, the apple loft. Yet throughout, original features had been preserved. The hardwood floors, the hand-carved stair, banister, the stained glass transom over the front door. The barn had been transformed into a community space with a farm-to-table restaurant on the ground floor and event facilities above. Local artisans' works decorated the walls, and informational displays chronicled the history of the Harper farm alongside the broader agricultural heritage of Lancaster County. "Your family's story is woven throughout," Jonathan explained as we explored. "We've used excerpts from your grandfather's diary and photographs from your family albums, with your permission, of course. Guests won't just be staying at a charming inn, they'll be experiencing living history." The gathering swelled as morning turned to afternoon. Local officials gave speeches praising the project's blend of preservation and innovation. The Historical Society president presented a special plaque designating Harper Hill as a site of historical significance. Local musicians played folk tunes on the lawn, and caterers circulated with appetizers featuring ingredients from neighboring farms. I was speaking with the landscape architect about Mom's roses when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "It really is beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to find Emily standing there, looking uncertain but present. Alone. You came, I said, not bothering to hide my surprise and delight. Brandon couldn't make it, she said, a slight edge to her voice telling me all I needed to know about that conversation. But I wanted to see it, to understand. I introduced her to the landscape architect who enthusiastically detailed how they'd identified and sourced all 27 varieties from Mom's original garden. As he excused himself to speak with other guests, Emily and I found ourselves alone together for the first time in nearly a year. I expected to be angry, she admitted, gazing around at the transformed property. To feel cheated somehow. But this, she gestured at the lovingly preserved buildings, the gardens, the community gathering on the lawn. This is something Grandma and Grandpa would have loved, something that honors them. That's what I wanted, I said softly. Not just to preserve buildings, but to preserve purpose. The farm was always about community, about nurturing growth, crops, yes, but also people, relationships, traditions. Emily nodded, her eyes suspiciously bright. I get that now. I didn't before, but I do now. She hesitated, then added, Brandon and I are separating. It's been coming for a while, but the farmhouse situation, it clarified some things for me. About what I value. About who I've become. I absorbed this revelation carefully, resisting both the urge to say good riddance and the maternal instinct to fix things. I'm sorry for your pain, but not sorry if it leads you back to yourself, I said finally. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, she replied with a watery smile. Find my way back to the person I was before I started seeing everything as a transaction or investment. Jonathan approached, offering champagne flutes. To new beginnings at Harper Hill, he proposed. We clinked glasses, and as the afternoon mellowed into evening, Emily and I walked the property together, reminiscing about childhood summers, holiday gatherings, the countless small moments that had unfolded on this land. With each shared memory, another tiny piece of our fractured relationship seemed to knit back together. Not perfect, still tender to the touch, but healing. As sunset painted the sky in hues of amber and rose, guests gathered on the lawn for the official ribbon cutting. Jonathan insisted that Emily and I join him for the ceremony. This property has been in the Harper family for 4 generations, he told the assembled crowd. While it's entering a new chapter now, its soul remains connected to the people who poured their lives into this land. I can think of no more fitting way to open Harper Hill Inn than to have Evelyn Harper, daughter of William and Margaret Harper, cut the ribbon. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering as Jonathan handed me the ceremonial scissors. Emily stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. With a deep breath and steady hands, I cut the blue ribbon stretched across the farmhouse porch steps. Applause erupted, and as I looked out over the crowd, neighbors, community leaders, new friends, I felt my parents' presence as surely as if they stood beside me. They would have understood that the essence of their legacy wasn't in ownership, but in stewardship. Not in control, but in care. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and fireflies began to dance across the darkening fields, Emily and I sat on the rebuilt porch swing, gently rocking back and forth just as I had done with my mother decades before. I'm sorry, Mom, she said quietly, for everything, for losing sight of what matters. I know, I replied, taking her hand in mine. I'm sorry, too, that it took such a rupture for both of us to find clarity. But we're here now, and that's what counts. We sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. The farmhouse behind us hummed with new life and purpose while the land stretched out before us, enduring as it had for generations. Something precious had been lost over the past year, but something equally valuable had been found. A deeper understanding of legacy, of dignity, of the quiet strength it takes to stand alone for what you believe. Family is not defined by who demands from you, I said softly, almost to myself, but by who respects your sacrifices. Love does not manipulate, and the greatest strength isn't found in anger, but in protecting your dignity, even if it means standing alone. Emily squeezed my hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. As we rocked gently in the gathering darkness, I felt the circle complete itself. The farmhouse had found its future, Emily was finding her way back to her true self, and I had found something I'd feared lost forever. The quiet certainty that I had honored my parents' legacy in the ways that truly mattered. Not through clinging to the past, but by ensuring its spirit lived on, transformed and renewed. ready to inspire generations yet to come.